In thinking about discernment and how Ignatius has written about it for us, to teach it to us, I really believe that it is the greatest gift he's given to the church from the spiritual exercises. And I say that from my own experience, because I knew nothing about any of these things. And until I had a spiritual director for the first time. And this director pointed out to me that what I was paying attention to and what I was living out of was really not from God. It was from another spirit. And I'm like, wow, I just had no idea. So it was a very freeing thing for me to consider that I could live from a different perspective, from a different identity of myself and God. And I don't know, it's just been a real gift to me in my life. So I do like to talk about it. There is a book by Mark Thibodeau called God's Voice Within, and he explains all of this clearly for me and for many people. And he talks about discerning the spirits as making a distinction between the opposing movements we have inside ourselves all of the time. And some of these movements are from God, and some of these movements are from other spirits that would either want to keep us from getting closer to God, or that are blocks that keep us from getting closer to God. So let's say it could be the evil spirit, in competition with God for our soul. It could also be old tapes. It could be learned behavior. It could be our learned response to things throughout our lives. To make that distinction between these two spirits is really important if we want to follow Christ. So I'm going to help us make that distinction this morning, hopefully, that we can look at what is called spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation. Now, you may have your own name for consolation. You might call it light or darkness, or highs or lows, or volcanoes or black holes. So it doesn't need the official name of consolation to it. What makes it a spiritual consolation versus a good mood, are taking in a beautiful sunset, or holding a newborn baby, is that those experiences will lead us to a deeper sense of love, to a deeper sense of hope or trust in God. That's what makes it spiritual. Our actions will move in that direction. So if it's a spiritual desolation, it isn't just that I'm in a bad mood or indigestion, or it isn't just that I'm grieving, or just that I might be depressed. It is that the spiritual desolation will move us away from God. It's going to decrease our faith, hope, and love in a way that our actions will be in a way that moves us away from God, in essence. So I'll explain what that means as we go forward. So if we look at the top of this graph here, feelings and moods that tend to increase our faith, hope, and love. We might have a moment of courage, to do something for the Lord, or the moment of courage to forgive someone. We might be trying to make a decision, and suddenly we have clarity about what God is asking. Or maybe we might experience a deep, deep peace that we've never known before, which then puts us in a different disposition than to respond to what's around us. Or we might find that we have more confidence, or willingness to risk. Maybe we can find ourselves being patient with waiting, persevering when things aren't clear. And we are doing that in the light of God's love. Or I might find that suddenly I'm accepting myself as loved by God. Maybe I'm more reverent towards other people. Maybe I'm more kind or generous or more grateful. Maybe I'm praising God more. So all of these things in that top half will lead our actions to something that is of God, that would draw us closer to God and other people in some way. If we're experiencing a spiritual desolation, then my feelings, attitudes, and moods will tend to a decrease in me towards faith, hope, and love. I'll have a lesser ability to have a deeper faith or to have hope or to love others or myself. So feelings like fear, shame, confusion, guilt, discouragement, despair, lack of confidence. Maybe I am in a space of negative or irreverent attitude towards myself or other people. So then my actions are going to be different than if I were in a consolation. For example, one time when I went to this same spiritual director, I was talking and he said, "Wow, I haven't heard you talk like that in a long time. What's going on?" So he noticed that what I was saying and how I was feeling was totally different than what I had discovered when I was in consolation. So he pointed out that I was in desolation, and he helped me to fight against it, in other words. But I wasn't even aware that I had moved to that other space. So, but you know, if I had thought about it, I would have noticed that my behavior towards other people was less than loving. I was more irritable, more critical, unhappy, was not open to new things, but I just didn't see it myself until he pointed it out. Now you can put your own words in these columns. They don't have to be, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just, you know, some ways of explaining this concept. One way of experiencing a spiritual consolation would be to, we've had such a beautiful moon this past month until it became full. And, you know, we can look at the sky and the stars and just be so swept up in their beauty. But if we're moved to gratitude to God, or if we move to a place of connectedness with the moon and the stars and all things, that would be a spiritual consolation. So I want us to look a little bit more at this influence from the power of evil or other spirits not of God versus the influence from God's Spirit, the power and freedom of the Holy Spirit. It gives us a further way to distinguish between the two by how they operate within us and what its motivations are. So for example, the evil spirit would want to destroy our freedom or our desire to always choose God, would want to turn us away from God, the truth of who we are, turn us away from others and God's plan, or to keep us from bearing good fruit. So an example that came to my mind was, I might think I'm in a spiritual desolation just because I'm grieving or just because I'm sick. But that doesn't make it spiritual. What makes it spiritual is that I would shut myself off from God. I would shut myself off from other people. And I would be very isolated and alone and sort of shut down. So how evil might try to impede our spiritual growth and bring us to desolation would be to inspire and play off of our fears. Now, fear is a normal human reaction, But, the evil spirit will wait. When we become afraid, will then, capitalize on that and find ways to increase our fear, by increase our thinking of, what else could happen, or the what ifs. This spirit would want to encourage weakness in us, would want to increase our self-doubt, decrease our trust in God. These spirits would want to tempt us not to acknowledge our gifts, or claim them, or use them, these gifts that are from God. Spiritual desolation will always turn us in on ourselves. So we would be self-absorbed, self-focused. These spirits would also take our normal, good, sensual desires in a negative direction to disordered desires and attachments. So our desires in and of themselves are good, until, the evil spirit or other spirits from our past would move us to a negative direction. So, like, my way of coping would be shopping or gaming or drinking or eating, whatever. So it capitalizes on what motivates us, but in negative ways, in ways that are self-serving towards riches, honor, and glory. So my actions would be towards making myself look good, making myself feel good, in a negative way that turns me in on myself, really gets a hold of that ego. We'll propose difficulties with moving in a positive direction. It's going to feel restless, disquieting, anxious, noisy inside of us. You can imagine water just dropping on a stone, that can feel kind of harsh. And so it's not going to feel comfortable at all, except perhaps in the beginning when we're being moved towards a disordered desire, or towards riches, honor, glory. That may feel good in the beginning, but it's not going to end up feeling that way if it's led by the other spirits. So how God's spirit works is God's motivation is to be our source of light and truth, to bring us into solidarity with who we most deeply are, who God is for us, in solidarity with the world, that will feel connected. This spirit desires to free us, not oppress us, to affirm and empower our gifts and call, to give us the courage to claim them, and will always desire that we bear good fruit. So how God's Spirit does this to bring us to a place of consolation, the Spirit might give us a deep peace, or a feeling of being comforted and consoled. The Spirit would strengthen us, encourage us. God's Spirit gives us increased faith, hope, and trust to sustain us for the journey. God's Spirit will always affirm our belovedness, will always affirm our call and our gifts, and it will be gentle and insistent. God's Spirit will always turn us to the awareness of other people, to turn us outward. So, the Spirit of God, once we're in touch with it, can't be contained. It's been made to flow outward. So we'll find us turned in another direction and, really wanting to belong and feel connected to people. Now, God's Spirit may sting our conscience when we're bound by a vice or a sin, or we've suddenly moved into a desolating space. Would prompt remorse for our sins, and would even show us the absurdity of the direction our life has taken if we're under the influence of the other spirit. So I don't know if you've ever had that experience of saying, well, now how did I get here? I started over here and things were good, but all of a sudden things started shifting and I'm now in a totally different space. So, God's Spirit would want to wake us up to the fact that, something is amiss. So we'll be gentle and persistent and quiet, like water soaking into a sponge. If you've ever read the Screwtape Letters, it gives you a perfect example of how this evil spirit works. So Screwtape is a representative of Satan, and he has a nephew, Wormwood, who is down on earth trying to corrupt souls. And so Screwtape writes letters to Wormwood about how to undermine the good attitudes and actions of people down on earth, to turn them towards, the evil side or the negative side of life. And, in some ways, it can help us kind of chuckle at ourselves because you can see yourself in this book and how these things might have happened to you. But it's also very true that how subversive and how subtle this other spirit can be.